Currency collapse isn't an event, it's an equation. In 265 AD, a Roman citizen could purchase a measure of wheat with 8 silver denarii. By 301 AD, the same measure cost 50,000 denarii. Not 50, not 500, 50,000. A price increase of 6,250% in 36 years. But this wasn't random inflation. It wasn't bad luck or poor harvests or barbarian disruption. It was mathematics, pure, predictable, unavoidable mathematics that has repeated itself with identical precision across every major currency collapse in recorded history. The equation is always the same. The variables change, but the relationship remains constant. When currency creation exceeds productive capacity by certain ratios for certain durations, collapse becomes mathematically inevitable. Not probable. Inevitable. As predictable as compound interest, as certain as gravity, as absolute as any law of physics. Today, the same mathematical forces that destroyed the Roman denarius, the German mark, and dozens of other currencies throughout history are building pressure within modern monetary systems. The numbers are different, but the equation is identical. The outcome is predetermined by mathematical law, just as it always has been, just as it always will be. Understanding this equation means understanding why currency collapse cannot be prevented through policy, negotiation, or wishful thinking. Mathematics doesn't negotiate. It doesn't compromise. It doesn't care about political consequences or social stability. It simply executes relentlessly and precisely until the equation balances through currency destruction. The Roman Empire provides the clearest demonstration of this mathematical inevitability because their records are extensive and their timeline is complete. We can track every variable, observe every relationship, and verify every outcome. The Roman monetary system operated under mathematical laws that remain unchanged today, producing results that modern economies will reproduce with identical precision. Emperor Nero began the debasement in 64 AD, reducing silver content in the denarius from 94% to 90%. A 4% reduction that seemed negligible at the time, but established the mathematical relationship that would eventually destroy Roman currency. The equation was simple: more currency units chasing the same amount of goods and services. The initial effect was minimal because the change was small and confidence remained high. But debasement, once begun, follows mathematical progression. Each emperor needed more currency to fund expanding military campaigns, public works, and administrative costs. Each reduction in silver content made the next reduction easier to justify and more necessary to implement. The mathematical relationship between currency quantity and purchasing power asserted itself gradually, then suddenly, then catastrophically. By 100 AD, under Emperor Trajan, silver content had fallen to 85%. Prices began rising noticeably. By 200 AD, under Septimius Severus, silver content was down to 60%. Inflation accelerated. By 250 AD, the denarius contained less than 5% silver. Hyperinflation destroyed the monetary system completely. The mathematical progression was exponential, following curves identical to every subsequent currency collapse. Slow debasement created moderate inflation. Accelerated debasement created severe inflation. Desperate debasement created hyperinflation and monetary system failure. The relationship between cause and effect never varied because mathematical laws don't vary. Modern economists argue that Rome lacked sophisticated understanding of monetary theory, that contemporary central banking prevents such primitive errors. This argument ignores the mathematical reality that currency-quantity relationships operate independently of theoretical understanding. Rome didn't fail because they misunderstood economics. They failed because they violated mathematical laws that cannot be suspended through better theory. The Weimar Republic provides an even more precise demonstration of this mathematical inevitability because their records are complete and their timeline is compressed. Germany's hyperinflation lasted only 4 years, from 1919 to 1923, but followed mathematical curves identical to Rome's longer collapse. The acceleration was faster, but the equation was unchanged. In 1919, one U.S. dollar bought 8.9 German marks. Moderate currency expansion had begun to fund war reparations and social programs, but the mathematical relationship between currency quantity and value remained stable. By 1920, $1 bought 39.5 marks. Currency creation had accelerated, and the mathematical impact became visible in exchange rates. The mathematical progression then accelerated exponentially. By 1921, $1 bought 75 marks. By 1922, 400 marks. By January 1923, 17,000 marks. By November 1923, 4.2 trillion marks. The mathematical relationship between currency quantity and purchasing power expressed itself with perfect precision across this timeline. Each stage of collapse followed predictable mathematical thresholds. When currency creation exceeded productive capacity by 50% annually, moderate inflation resulted. When expansion reached 100% annually, severe inflation followed. When creation exceeded 300% annually, hyperinflation became inevitable. These thresholds remain constant across all historical examples because they represent mathematical limits, not policy choices. Weimar authorities tried every conceivable policy response to interrupt this mathematical progression. Price controls, rationing, currency reform, international borrowing, foreign exchange manipulation. Nothing worked because policy cannot override mathematical law. When currency quantity exceeds economic production by sufficient margins, purchasing power collapses regardless of governmental intervention. The velocity of money provides the clearest mathematical indicator of approaching collapse. Velocity measures how quickly currency changes hands within the economy. Under normal conditions, velocity remains relatively stable. During currency crisis, velocity accelerates exponentially as people try to spend depreciating currency before it loses more value. Roman records show velocity increases preceding each major debasement period. Citizens recognized silver content reduction and spent coins more quickly to avoid losses. This increased velocity amplified the inflationary impact of each debasement, creating feedback loops that accelerated currency destruction. Weimar Germany demonstrated this velocity acceleration with mathematical precision. In 1919, mark velocity was approximately normal. By 1922, velocity had doubled. By 1923, people were spending money within hours of receiving it. Velocity approached infinity as the currency became worthless, faster than transactions could be completed. Modern economists attempt to control velocity through interest rate manipulation, believing they can manage mathematical relationships through policy adjustment. This approach ignores the fundamental reality that velocity reflects confidence, and confidence cannot be manufactured through central bank operations. When citizens lose faith in currency stability, velocity increases regardless of interest rate levels. The debt-to-productive capacity ratio provides another mathematical predictor of currency collapse. All failed currencies exceeded certain debt thresholds relative to their economy, its ability to service obligations through legitimate production. When debt service requires currency creation rather than economic output, mathematical collapse becomes inevitable. Rome's debt burden grew exponentially during the debasement period. Military campaigns generated obligations that exceeded tax revenues. Public works created liabilities that surpassed economic productivity. Administrative costs consumed resources that couldn't be replaced through legitimate commerce. The mathematical gap between obligations and capacity widened until currency creation became the only mechanism for meeting commitments. Weimar Germany inherited debt obligations from World War I that exceeded their productive capacity by orders of magnitude. Reparation payments alone required more resources than the German economy could generate. Social programs, reconstruction costs, and governmental operations created additional obligations that made balanced budgets mathematically impossible. Modern debt levels in developed economies now exceed historical collapse thresholds by substantial margins. United States federal debt approaches 130% of gross domestic product, the level at which currency crises typically begin. Interest payments alone consume increasingly large percentages of tax revenues, creating mathematical feedback loops identical to those that destroyed previous currencies. The critical threshold appears to be approximately 90% debt to GDP for extended periods or 130% for shorter periods. Beyond these levels, debt service requirements begin consuming currency creation capacity, leaving insufficient expansion room for economic growth or crisis response. The mathematics become impossible to balance without either default or hyperinflation. Trade balance relationships provide additional mathematical predictors of currency collapse. Currencies that lose reserve status typically experience persistent trade deficits that must be financed through currency creation or foreign borrowing. When foreign creditors lose confidence and demand different payment methods, currency collapse accelerates rapidly. Rome maintained trade surpluses during the early empire, but experienced growing deficits as military expenses increased and productivity declined. Foreign territories that had previously accepted Roman currency began demanding payment in silver rather than coins, recognizing the mathematical reality of debasement before Roman citizens understood the implications. Britain experienced similar mathematical pressure during the 1920s and 1930s. Sterling trade deficits required gold payments to foreign creditors. Britain's gold reserves were finite, creating mathematical limits on their ability to maintain fixed exchange rates. When reserves approached depletion, currency devaluation became mathematically inevitable. Modern America runs persistent trade deficits that require foreign financing. Dollar reserve status allows this arrangement to continue temporarily, but mathematical limits still apply. Foreign creditors aren't required to accept unlimited dollars, and their willingness to do so depends on confidence in dollar stability. When confidence breaks, mathematical rebalancing occurs rapidly. The money supply expansion ratios provide the most direct mathematical predictor of currency collapse. Historical analysis reveals consistent relationships between currency creation rates and collapse timelines. Moderate expansion can continue indefinitely. Aggressive expansion creates instability within years. Desperate expansion causes collapse within months. Rome's money supply expansion accelerated throughout the debasement period. Early emperors increased currency quantity by single-digit percentages annually. Middle period emperors expanded supply by double-digit percentages. Final period emperors created currency at triple-digit annual rates before the system collapsed completely. Weimar expansion followed identical mathematical progression. Currency creation began at moderate levels to fund reparations and social programs. Political pressure to maintain living standards drove expansion to dangerous levels. Final desperation to prevent economic collapse pushed creation to hyperinflationary levels that destroyed the currency entirely. Modern central banks have expanded currency supplies at rates that exceed historical collapse thresholds. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet grew from $800 billion in 2008 to $9 trillion in 2022, and 100% increase in 14 years. European and Japanese central banks implemented similar expansion policies simultaneously. These expansion rates exceed anything attempted by previous monetary systems that maintained stability. Rome took 2 centuries to achieve similar debasement ratios. Weimar Germany required 4 years. Modern central banks accomplished equivalent expansion in barely a decade while arguing that different economic theories make different outcomes possible. The mathematical relationships don't support this optimism. Currency quantity affects purchasing power according to laws that operate independently of economic theories or policy innovations. Modern technology allows faster currency creation, which means mathematical consequences arrive more quickly, not more safely. Confidence decay follows mathematical curves that remain consistent across historical examples. Initial currency expansion creates mild concern. Continued expansion generates moderate anxiety. Accelerated expansion produces panic selling. These confidence transitions occur at predictable thresholds regardless of communication strategies or policy explanations. Roman citizens initially accepted modest debasement because changes seemed reasonable and temporary. Continued debasement created suspicion about imperial monetary management. Obvious debasement triggered confidence collapse and currency rejection. The transition points were mathematically predictable based on the magnitude and duration of debasement. Weimar Germany experienced identical confidence transitions at mathematically similar thresholds. Germans initially accepted moderate currency expansion as necessary for economic recovery. Continued expansion created doubt about governmental competence. Extreme expansion triggered complete confidence collapse and currency abandonment. Modern surveys show confidence patterns that mirror historical examples. Initial central bank expansion generated mild concern among informed observers. Continued quantitative easing created moderate anxiety about monetary policy sustainability. Current expansion levels are producing panic responses among institutional investors who understand historical precedents. The mathematical nature of these confidence transitions means they cannot be reversed through communication or policy adjustment once certain thresholds are crossed. Confidence operates according to mathematical laws similar to currency debasement. Small changes create proportional responses. Large changes create exponential responses that cannot be controlled through conventional means. Reserve currency status provides temporary mathematical protection that delays but doesn't prevent collapse dynamics. Reserve currencies can maintain stability longer than domestic currencies because international demand provides additional purchasing power support. But reserve status also creates larger mathematical imbalances when collapse occurs. Sterling maintained reserve currency status for decades after fundamental mathematical problems emerged. International demand for pounds allowed Britain to run deficits and maintain living standards that domestic production couldn't support. But this arrangement created mathematical tensions that eventually produced more severe currency crisis than would have occurred with earlier adjustment. Dollar reserve status currently provides similar mathematical protection for American monetary policy. International demand for dollars allows persistent trade deficits and fiscal policies that domestic production can't sustain indefinitely. But these arrangements create mathematical imbalances that will eventually require correction through either gradual adjustment or sudden collapse. The mathematical indicators all suggest gradual adjustment isn't occurring. Trade deficits continue expanding. Currency creation accelerates rather than moderates. Debt accumulation exceeds productive capacity growth. International creditors show increasing reluctance to accumulate additional dollar reserves. The mathematical pressure builds rather than dissipates. Historical precedent indicates that reserve currency collapse, when it occurs, happens faster and more completely than domestic currency failure. Sterling lost reserve status within years once the mathematical breaking point was reached. The dollar transition, when it occurs, will likely follow similar mathematical timeline patterns. Understanding these mathematical relationships doesn't require predicting specific dates or events. Currency collapse follows mathematical laws that operate with scientific precision, but timing depends on confidence dynamics that can vary significantly. The mathematical outcome is certain, but the schedule remains variable. What isn't variable is the mathematical nature of the process. Currency collapse will occur when mathematical thresholds are exceeded for sufficient duration. The thresholds are known from historical analysis. The duration requirements are established through precedent. The current measurements indicate that mathematical limits are being approached rapidly. Policy cannot prevent mathematical law from operating. Political will cannot suspend mathematical relationships. Economic theory cannot alter mathematical realities. Currency collapse occurs when mathematical conditions are met, regardless of human preferences or intentions. The mathematics are universal, absolute, and inevitable. They operate across cultures, centuries, and civilizations with identical precision. They destroyed Rome's denarius according to mathematical law. They obliterated Weimar's mark through mathematical necessity. They will eliminate modern currencies through mathematical certainty when the same conditions are replicated. Currency collapse isn't random. It isn't mysterious. It isn't unpredictable. It's mathematics, pure, simple, unavoidable mathematics that operates according to laws as reliable as any in the physical sciences. The equation balances eventually, always, without exception. The only variables are timing and magnitude. The outcome is predetermined by mathematical law. The mathematics behind every currency collapse since Rome are identical, because mathematical relationships don't change. Technology evolves, theories develop, policies adapt, but mathematics remains constant. Currency quantity affects purchasing power according to laws that operated in ancient Rome and operate today with equal force and identical precision. Understanding this mathematical reality means recognizing that current monetary policies are following historical patterns with mathematical precision toward historical outcomes with mathematical inevitability. The equation is already unbalancing. The mathematics are already operating. The outcome is already determined by laws that cannot be negotiated, compromised, or suspended. Currency collapse is an equation, and the equation always balances.